Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At risk of repeating what has been said so many times in the House today, New Democrats support trade deals that reduce tariffs and boost exports, while remaining firm that components like investor-state provisions that threaten sovereignty have no place in trade deals.
Bravo.
In our view, the job of government is to pursue better trade. That's trade that boosts human rights and labor standards, protects the environment, and protects, above anything, Canadian jobs. Final trade deal must be based on its net costs and benefits. And we've always been clear on this, and we've opposed trade deals in the past that would have a net negative impact on Canadian jobs and environment. And again, I'll repeat my colleague, particularly the member from Essex, who's been so strong on this file. Trade with Europe is too important to get wrong. The NDP supports deepening our Canada-EU trading relationship in order to diversify our markets. But there remain significant concerns and unanswered questions about the proposed CETA deal. Number one, changes in CETA will increase drug costs for consumers. Second, there are concerns about local procurement, particularly for local governments. Third, investor-state provisions will have to be removed before this deal is ratified. And fourth, Liberals have not properly compensated dairy farmers for their loss of market share under CETA. So number one, increasing drug costs are a significant and known downside of CETA, and yet the Liberals have not delivered on their promised compensation to the provinces and territories for the increased costs of prescription drugs to provincial taxpayers and consumers. Changes to intellectual property rights for pharmaceuticals under CETA are expected to increase drug costs by more than $850 million annually. Now, quoting Jim Kean, the president of the Canadian Generic Pharmaceutical Association, he says, quote, a study prepared for the Canadian Genetic Pharmaceutical Association by two leading Canadian health economists in early 2011 estimated that, if adopted, the proposals would delay the introduction of new generic medicines in Canada by an average of 3.5 years. The cost of pharmaceutical payers of this delay was estimated at $2.8 billion annually based on generic prices in 2010, end quote. Now, the Canadian Federation of Nurses Unions have also warned that it could make it more difficult to bring down drug prices through a national pharmacare program if CETA comes in. Now, in opposition, the Liberals demanded that the Conservatives present a study of the financial impacts on provinces and territorial governments, both on their healthcare systems and on prescription drug costs. Now in government, though, they're telling the provinces that they will cut healthcare transfers while pursuing agreements that risk increasing drug costs for the provinces. According to the Canadian Health Coalition, the delayed arrival of cheaper generics will increase the cost of prescription drugs to Canadians between $850 million and $2.8 billion a year. And CETA is the first Canadian bilateral free trade agreement since NAFTA that includes a chapter on intellectual property rights, going well beyond Canada's existing obligations. The increased patent protections granted to brand name pharmaceuticals were an EU priority, but they're not a Canadian priority. We heard this all the time during the election campaign, door knocking in all kinds of neighborhoods. We heard from Canadians who are splitting their pills, who are skipping prescriptions, not taking their full prescribed drugs each day, having to make the terrible choice between buying food and taking the medication that their doctors had prescribed. That is a terrible situation, and to think that this government would risk exacerbating that problem for consumers is unimaginable to me and certainly not consistent with campaign promises. My second area of concern is around local procurement. When I was elected to local government, the TILMA agreement was proposed, and this was very controversial in British Columbia. More and more local governments are encouraged, when they raise taxes from property owners, that they want to then spend those taxes as much as they can in the local community. The local government is going to contract someone to put up a website, for example. Or if they are catering food within a government operation or a public function, they might bias that procurement towards local providers and maybe even pay a premium. This has been done more and more. But these local procurement restrictions increasingly threaten and intimidate local governments from doing those fantastic things that are good for local business, good for local economy. We hear that above a certain threshold, minimum local content policies will be outlawed, even in municipal and provincial government procurement. And companies will also have an expanded ability to use temporary foreign workers without a study of impacts on Canadians. My third area of concern is investor-state provisions. These are mechanisms that allow a foreign corporation to sue our government if they feel that our regulations have impeded their ability to profit. And we know this too well in Canada. Canada's already one of the most sued countries in the world under investor-state dispute mechanisms. Canadian companies have won only 3 of 39 cases against foreign governments. And our government continues to get new complaints seeking billions of dollars in damages. One example that's currently before the courts is Lone Pine Resources, an oil and gas developer that had obtained an exploration permit to look for shale gas under the St. Lawrence River. And the Quebec government took the very bold step of revoking the permit in response to constituent concerns over fracking. But Lone Pine sued the Canadian government under its U.S. affiliate under NAFTA Chapter 11, seeking $250 million in compensation.
Oh, wow.
Now, what other province is going to be as brave as the Quebec government to take a stand against something like fracking if they have got this kind of chill? And this is a real problem. Existing investor-state dispute provisions have also contributed to regulatory chill, where governments fail to take actions in the public interest where they fear that it may trigger an investor claim. Now, quoting the Canadian Environmental Law Association, they say, quote, CETA will significantly impact environmental protection and sustainable development in Canada. In particular, the inclusion of investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, the liberalization of trade and services, and the deregulation of government procurement rules will impact the federal and provincial government's authority to protect the environment, promote resource conservation, or use green procurement as a means of advancing environmental policies and objectives. That worries me, every piece of it. In February 2016, during CETA's legal scrubbing phase, the minister announced changes to the ISDS provisions that are supposed to improve transparency and strengthen measures to combat conflicts of interest of arbitrators. However, the new court system still allows foreign investors to seek compensation from any level of government over any policy decision they feel impacts their profits. Liberals still haven't explained how they would ensure environmental health and safety regulations will be protected from foreign challenges. Fourth, the Liberals have not properly compensated dairy farmers for loss of market share under CETA. Now, quoting the Dairy Farmers of Canada, quote, CETA will result in an expropriation of up to 2% of Canadian milk production, representing 17,700 tons of cheese that will no longer be produced in Canada. This is equivalent to the entire yearly production of the province of Nova Scotia and will cost Canadian dairy farmers up to $116 million a year in perpetual lost revenues. We cannot afford to be making and processing less of our own food. We cannot afford to be putting dairy farmers who are at the foundation of the way that our country and our rural economies have grown. We cannot let this go. The Liberals also have not explained whether and how they'll compensate Newfoundland and Labrador fish processing losses. Again, this is a time we should be adding value to our natural resources, not trading them away. Given all these concerns and all these unresolved issues, I will quote Maud Barlow from Council of Canadians, who says, quote, given the process could take another 5 years in Europe, what's the rush here other than another photo op? There needs to be a fuller public consultation process on CETA, just as the government has done with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I will leave finally by saying once again that New Democrats want better trade, trade that boosts human rights and labor standards, protects the environment, and protects Canadian jobs. And this is not a progressive trade deal until those measures are implemented. If the Liberal government will not stand up for progressive trade deals, New Democrats surely will. Thank you.